Let's talk about the unfolding conflict in the Middle East. I mean, we have no things might have changed quite radically by the time people are watching this, but at the time we're expecting uh, Israel to retaliate to a strike from Iran, which was hitting Tel Aviv. Extraordinary in response, as probably as expected, to the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, the former head of Hezbollah. Um, Israel has quite incredibly wiped out a huge chunk of Hezbollah's leaders, but still, it feels like Iran had to make some kind of retaliation to not lose face. I guess is the
Yeah, I suppose it's because so much has happened in such a short space of time. It's easy to not take all of it in. I mean, I think by the time we recorded last week's podcast, Nasrallah hadn't even been assassinated yet.
yeah
That in and of itself is such a tremendous moment, not only in Israel's attempt to neutralize Hezbollah so that they can return those 60,000 Israelis back to northern Israel, because since October the 8th, Hezbollah have been shelling that part of the country in solidarity with the pogromists of Hamas, but also the centrality of Hezbollah to the so-called axis of resistance, propped up and funded and backed by Iran. I mean, Hezbollah was always essentially kind of Iran's insurance policy against any conflict with Israel. The idea that if anything happened, that therefore they would come under fire from that border to their north. Now, not just with Nasrallah, but also the pagers and the walkie-talkies and the precision strikes on various Hezbollah leaders. They've lost basically almost entirely their first tier and second tier command structure in an incredibly short space of time. And they're very significant, not just to Iran, but to the kind of broader axis, so-called. They were involved in training various other proxies. And so we're at a really significant moment. I mean, I think the other thing that's worth stressing is that the Iran attack on Israel was a significant step up to what happened back in April when they fired rockets at them for the first time. Back in April, it was something which was very clearly telegraphed that they were going to do this. They also fired a mixture of kind of ballistic missiles, but also drones and things that were a lot easier to pick out of the sky. This time it was all ballistic missiles, things that very little warning was also telegraphed that this was going to happen. And there was a much greater intent to actually inflict damage on Israel this time around. But also it's been an expression, I think, of Iran's weakness in many respects. The fact that it has had its key militia in the form of Hezbollah being decapitated essentially overnight. And also because of the fact that domestically it's so weakened, not only by external sanctions, but also by an increasingly restive population. They did feel the need for issues of pride and so on, that they needed to retaliate. But at the same time, they appear a very weakened power than they were even a week ago at this point.
Simon.
Yes, again, agree with all of that. It's very interesting. I'm not a foreign affairs expert. Perhaps I don't know whether I'm what insights you want me to offer, but I feel sometimes more capable of observing resonances. And it reminded me much less of a war film than of the final scenes of The Godfather. I wanted to see it intercut with Netanyahu attending the christening, or not christening, the bar mitzvah of, the wiping out of all these senior figures. And as you say, you take out the top tier, and that's one thing. But the people were being sort of promoted, as it were, and assassinated within days. And at some point, yes, it is organised crime, essentially, Hezbollah, rather than anything more like a traditional military or political unit. And if you destroy that much, there's no kind of culture. There's no kind of, right, read the manual quickly, we need you to take over. It's going to be absolutely crippling. I don't know whether they can come back from it. I'm also interested in what you say about Iran. I think, as you say, restive is a good word for their population. It's clearly an extraordinarily unpopular regime, even within Iran. It's interesting the way that Islamist Gazans and so on and Hamas refer to the Zionist entity. They hate to even say the word Israel. They like to pretend it's almost makes it sound like an alien or something, the Zionist entity. But I think that word is sort of more appropriate to the Islamic Republic of Iran, a power that has control within the country, but is it's so deeply unpopular. It's interesting that it's even more than obviously it's an endless conversation that people go, you do realize Hamas, would kill you, you're gay, or they would force you to do this or that. But there's a lot of left-wing people in this country and around the world and in the West who have had enough of Iran's regime now. So they've lost that as well. So it's unpicking these threads and finding out where they go back to is the key. And I've begun to think that Israel's intelligence and planning, and that they are several moves ahead. I have that strong sense now. God knows from how far back, or who knew what, or was thinking this is the time when we need to act, because clearly there are demographic changes taking place in the West and in America in particular. If they lose America, then Israel will struggle to survive, so they have to reshape their part of the world as quickly as possible while they still have sufficiently strong support, I think, within Washington to do so. And they may be thinking of doing something really quite decisive. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I don't know, but obviously they are quite familiar with the idea of taking decisive action that many of us would rather sort of step back from.
And it's been striking how there's been this sort of the commentary in the West is very much as if any sort of reaction from Israel was going to be illegitimate or warmongering. There's been, aside from understandable concerns about the extent to which this conflict could broaden, widen, suck different powers in,
spiral out of control.
There's that's obviously understandable, but there's almost, because there is this sort of ambient anti-Israel sentiment, the idea that responding in any way would be, first of all, understandable, but also obviously preferable from the perspective of Israel, was instantly kind of cast into doubt. Like there is this kind of idea that the best thing they could possibly do is just hunker down and hope that the Iron Dome sorts them out. Like no appreciation whatsoever that you've got a nation which is surrounded by these proxy forces propped up by Iran, who are united primarily by their loathing of the Jewish state and Jews fundamentally. That they've had to deal with constant rocket fire from their near abroad, and that there is a power who has been orchestrating and pushing this for some time, who then in recent days have fired so many missiles at them to the point where this is something which is a really significant moment for this nation and its defense of itself. The idea that it's almost outrageous or wrong-headed or reckless that they would want to deal with that threat in one way, shape or form, I found is always quite striking. But it has obviously been the nature of our discussion here in Britain, and certainly in the US as well, of Israel, which is to say that it's always the one that is overreacting. It's always the one that is overstepping the mark, despite the fact that it's coming under this supreme force and power.
Even the decapitation of Hezbollah leaders and targeted attacks like the pager attack are described as by some Westerners as being almost anti-civilian moves. There's nothing, no amount of targeting, no amount of precision, no amount of clarity on Israel's part can dislodge this idea that it's just this maniac genocidal state, which is
I think part of that, to be fair, maybe to be devil's advocate even, but I think part of that is the sense that we all feel, or many people in the West feel, they have a responsibility for Israel. Obviously Israel to some extent is the West cipher in that part of the world. We arm Israel. America has supported Israel for its entire existence, and it is perceived as being a sort of proxy in that regard. If there were, I suppose it's that sense that the left have in particular, that that they feel it's being done in their name, whereas nothing is being done by Hamas in anyone's name in this country. Nothing is being done by Hezbollah, but it's not an entirely sort of, it's not an entirely distant, arbitrary quarrel. We feel we have skin in this game whether we want to or not.
That's one of the interesting hypocrisies. I think you've got a kind of nominally anti-imperialist left who, if you're looking at what they're saying recently, think it is now basically the job of the American empire to tell this uppity little country not to defend itself